Hello friends, family, fellow patriots, Lord Stompy here, welcome. This video is part 3 in my series on the liberal high IQ delusion. In part 1 and 2, I discussed how the high IQ myth is a central myth in modern liberalism, and this is the belief that having a high IQ is the most important factor in holding a civilization together. And I believe this is a delusional and harmful myth. I think it has done a lot of damage to Western civilization, and we really have to get back to basics to rebuild and reclaim our civilization from these chattering classes who are now currently ruling the West with a high IQ hegemony. Now, one of my subscribers pointed out that what we call high IQ today is not really high IQ, and I discussed that in my last video. What we call high IQ these days is more to do with a class of people who are really good at manipulating modern systems, and they completely neglect the most fundamental aspects of civilization, such as your ability to defend yourself and your borders with strength and might. They also have completely undermined the industrial base of the West. So this has been a recipe for disaster since around about the mid-1990s. This cult of the high IQ technocrat classes has really taken off. And in my last video, I was discussing how in the 1980s here in Australia, we still had a reasonable industrial base. And the industrialists and the workers were still valued as a very important sector of our society. And they had a lot of say and a lot of input into how our society was run. And I pointed out in that video that sometime around about the mid-1990s, I noticed there was a new class of young women arising. These were the newly liberated young women who were coming out of universities. And they were far more ideologically indoctrinated in, well, basically what has become modern wokeism. These women were angry about refugee rights, gay rights, and racism, and being kind to the indigenous people. All these things weren't problems when I was young in the 1980s. These were very trivial issues. Nobody overly cared about them. In the 1980s, a small minority of people back in that era would agitate for those issues, but they were considered Fruit Loops and freaks and far left. So we had the rise of the angry young liberated women, and that was basically an early warning that the new liberal technocratic classes, which now have a very firm grip upon our Western civilization, were rising. These young women were educated in our universities to become the new leaders of tomorrow. They considered themselves the intellectual elites, even though they were very young and naive and stupid. We suddenly had a wave of popular female politicians one that I remember very well because I was friends with her in school was a young woman called Natasha Stott Despoja. And she rose to great prominence during the 1990s here in Australia as a it's a bit hard to say. Yeah, well, she wasn't fully woke like modern people are, but she was seen as the poster child of the newly liberated, strong women who were entering leadership roles and defining the new era of leadership in the 1990s. So these were the early warning signs for the downhill slide. Speaking of young women getting into power, this always is an early warning sign. And this is a tactic that is used by the American military industrial complex to destroy the cultural and social fabric of nations that they invade. Now, there's a very, very awful kind of chap by the name of Tom Barnett. He's a very high up lad in the American neocon think tanks. His position of authority is so high in America that whenever there is a new general who is promoted to the rank of general in America, the first thing they do after they get promoted to the rank of general is they're required to have a face-to-face briefing from Tom Barnett. Now, this horrific man, this liberal elite, this driver of the liberal engine, he did a video. I will find it. It was on YouTube. And he gives a talk of about 45 minutes where he discusses various ways of forcing modern liberalism into reluctant cultures. These are nations that the Americans have invaded. This includes our own Western nations. And he said one of the key strategies they use especially when they invade traditionalist Islamic nations, there was two very interesting strategies for warfare upon the civilian population. Was the first thing they do is they hand out free nigger rap to the youth, because they found that rap music is highly addictive to youth, people going through puberty. And he rightfully said this is a phase where young people are starting to form their identity and they want to make their mark on the world. And this is a highly aggressive, intoxicating form of music. So it immediately negrifies the populations, the younger people in the population, and turns them into very, very rebellious, troublesome kind of youth. The second factor that Tom Barnett talks about in subverting the invaded populations is once they take control of a nation, they immediately put young, inexperienced women in charge. And he said, this is his own words, he said when you get a traditional Islamic nation that's run by old traditionalist men, and suddenly you take their power away and you put naive young women in charge, he said almost overnight their culture will collapse. So you have it from the horse's mouth, Tom Barnett. I'll try and find that video and put a link below so you guys can watch it. It's a real eye-opener on the kinds of asymmetrical warfare that the American military-industrial complex utilizes against civilian populations. So these are the kind of dirty tricks that the liberal elites like to play upon all the civilian populations around the world. The liberal elites want to keep a power block, a hegemony over power here in the West and here in nations that they control. And I discussed this in my previous videos where I said basically the so-called high IQ classes now are actually just a parasitic power block that have been draining the West of life and blood for decades now. The last sane era we really had was the 1980s, when there was still sensible, more old-fashioned men in power, in charge of our affairs. So there's a lot of unpredictable laws in life, and having a high IQ and having a hegemonic block of very high IQ think tanks and people running your nation is no guarantee that your nation is going to prosper and do well. So there's one law of nature that always comes back to bite high-level civilizations on the bum. And this law of nature is primitive force will inevitably beat a high IQ. And we see this time and time again being played out throughout history, throughout the natural world. You'll have these very high IQ cultures or very high IQ smart-ass people, and they'll do very, very well for a while. But one day they come up against the wrong kind of brute force, and they don't really read the signs properly, or they fail to get out the way, and that is all it takes is one blow from a brute force factor, and that's you are put in your place. Now, to put this into perspective, a civilization that ended up wreaking huge amounts of havoc against civilizations that were much more developed and had much higher IQs was back in the Mongolian hordes day, right? So you had China, you had Europe, and you had the Islamic Caliphate. And these were all civilizations who'd gone through a large amount of development. They understood agriculture, they lived in large cities, and by comparison, the Mongolians had never really built anything other than a yurt. They were incredibly primitive compared to the civilizations that surrounded them. But they managed to get organized behind a warlord, and what they did have was an incredible strength and incredible brutality. And all these modern armies, the European armies, the Chinese army, and the Islamic armies just absolutely crumbled before the primitive brute strength of the Mongolians and all the high IQ and high tech of the day. It wasn't enough to prevent the savage hordes from going completely mental and just rewriting the maps of Eurasia and Eastern Europe and all the way down to Baghdad. They actually got that far. They went all the way from the steppes of Siberia all the way down and conquered Baghdad. So this is the classic case of low IQ brute force, always winning. Now, high IQ cultures or people are able to keep this low IQ brute force factor in check for a little while. But the premise that your high IQ culture will always be able to do that is on very shaky foundations. So if you believe that Western people with their big brains can continue to have sovereignty and a large amount of hegemony over the modern world, that's very, very delusional thinking. To put this into perspective, when I was making the transition from libtard into nationalist, there was a period of about a year and a half where I was basically, for a short while, I was a libertarian and then I was a civic nationalist. And when I was a civic nationalist, I would always laugh at how primitive and superstitious and backwards Islam seemed to be. And I was under this liberal high IQ delusion that we were much smarter and much more adept at running civilizations. So we were always going to keep a hegemony over our civilization, and unless these Muslims modernized and improved themselves, there were always going to be these backwards, superstitious, primitive people. And now I've reached this point in nationalism where I can see the liberal delusions for what they are. I can see this was a very, very dangerous and very common viewpoint that liberals all throughout the West have. They completely underestimate the brute force factor represented by Islam. So, as I said, the whole idea that your high IQ is going to always be able to hold low IQ brute force in check, it's on very shaky ground. First of all, you're assuming your society is always going to have a strong military force to defend itself. You're assuming your civilization is always going to have very strong social structures and strong industrial base, and that your society is going to be able to support the intellectual classes. Now, as soon as a civilization takes a very big downturn, there's suddenly not much to support the intellectual classes, right? So if we take this to its ultimate endpoint, there is a very high IQ guy called Chris Langan. His IQ is estimated at somewhere over 180. This guy is a genius. There is no doubt about it. Very, very smart guy. I'm sure he'd be very, very useful in a whole range of positions. And if he was given the opportunity and the right setting, I'm sure he could solve a lot of problems with his intellectual genius. But imagine we take Chris Langan with his 180 IQ and put him in Zimbabwe. Okay, Zimbabwe, a completely primitive, failed state. What use is high IQ in a primitive, failed state like Zimbabwe? What use is a super genius IQ in a nation like South Africa, which is now currently failing? You can be the smartest guy in the world, but if you're just surrounded by primitive brutality, you have no cultural network to support and utilize your incredible brand of genius. So what the truly high IQ people need to be of use to a civilization is a civilization where IQ actually matters and where IQ is valued, and where a civilization that actually knows how to properly utilize IQ for solving problems and making civilization a better place. Now, Western civilization isn't like that anymore. As I said in my previous videos, the intelligentsia classes, the high IQ classes, they're not solving any problems anymore. They're basically creating more problems than they're solving these days. They've become a cancer, a kind of parasite on our European culture. We need a complete restructuring from branched through to root to fix this completely imbalanced society. We have allowed young women, young inexperienced women, to gain a lot of leadership roles, and we allowed this decades ago. And essentially, what does a young woman without children know about the world and about life? This is why young, inexperienced women are promoted by the liberal elites. It is very, very easy to control and manipulate young, inexperienced women if you use the right techniques. And as a liberal elite, you will be able to... These younger, inexperienced women are very, very hungry to get on the ladder of power and climb it. As I said, I went to school with the politician Natasha Stott Despoja. She was a very meek, quiet sort of woman, but once she got into the halls of power here in Canberra, suddenly she sort of exploded with this intense desire just to have her name and face plastered all over the media. She really wanted to be seen as a mover and shaker. She was the poster girl for the powerful, liberated new woman of the time. So she was a young, naive, childless woman. I think she is still childless. Last time I checked, she was. And she's getting pretty old now. So I don't think she's had any children. Maybe I'm wrong. But if she had children, it was long after her political days were over. So this is the problems we're facing with the high IQ delusion. Our liberal intelligentsia are completely overestimating their personal power. Basically, they've rigged all the systems in the West so that they're keeping themselves in a hegemonic little power block. And basically, they're the liberal intelligentsia classes now are basically soft tyrants holding the European civilization to ransom. Right, so all these petty intellectuals filling out all these petty middle management roles here in the West, they're the ones who are actually most pushing the woke agendas, all the delusional agendas that the West is now a post-industrial society, and all we have to do is increase the number of bureaucrats in Western society, and that will make life better. This delusion of the high IQ intellectual classes is firmly entrenched in the power structures of the West. It's a civilizational problem at this point in time. It's also a social problem. the social networks of the West are still very much built around this high IQ myth, and this belief that instead of farmers and workers and useful people, that all we need is more bureaucrats and technocrats, and we can solve all our Western problems. Now, having said all that, I will say in the last word again that the idea that primitive forces will eventually beat this cosmopolitan high IQ class. It's not just pure physical violence that can beat the high IQ class. There is a libertarian, contrarian woman. Her name is Camille Paglia. And basically she's a contrarian liberal bisexual. This is a bit weird. She gained a lot of notoriety in the 90s by pushing a lot of very hard-edged contrarian material, and she actually tore huge strips off of the gay community and off the cosmopolitan liberal classes, despite the fact that Camille Paglia was a liberal herself. And she was basically trying to prove the same point as I'm proving here. She was saying that basically intellectual intelligence is not a firm foundation to build a civilization on. And one of the examples she used that was very telling was, she said, well, you have all this new breed of women here in the 1990s who all think they're highly educated, they're very intelligent, they're going to climb the ranks of power, and they're doing a wonderful job. And she said these women think this will make men respect them as their equals. And she pointed out something very clever. It was real street logic, actually. She said one thing that gets all these high IQ liberal women really, really angry with men is when you get a young, very good looking, very seductive woman, and she charms and seduces the very powerful man in the office. And that guy ends up being very loyal and but towards this seductive, young, good-looking woman. And he ends up lavishing her with lots of loyalty and gifts and money, all this sort of stuff. As she said, suddenly these high IQ women realize that a big pair of tits will get more power. That will entice more male power than a woman who is this high class intellectual who just wants to sit around debating. Okay, so what she was pointing out there, that the woman's biological role is basically having children. And if you have a young, healthy, very fertile woman, even these high-powered liberal men are actually going to drop their guard and allow this kind of woman to have a lot of influence over them. Whereas these same men aren't going to allow these liberal chattering class women to have very much influence over him. So this is a basic biological reality. And once again, what the young seductive woman represents is the primitive force of pure raw biology. And This is something that the high IQ woman in a power suit cannot ever compete with. This is something that these high IQ power women don't even compute into their calculations. And this is the weak point of modern liberalism. It never calculates the most fundamental principles into its worldview. This is the Achilles heel of modern liberalism right here. It's based on these technocratic think tanks and these bourgeois liberal manners and values and this bourgeois liberal worldview that is very, very blind to the hard realities of life. So this is a major factor. So it's not just the men and women who are out of balance. It's also, even to a large degree, our military powers. The Western military powers we are the most highly advanced military powers in the world, or at least we have been up until very, very recently. And we've had a series of wars since World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf Wars, etc. And essentially, we've not had any decisive victories in any of these wars. None at all. All our giant high IQ big brains haven't been able to give us victories on the ground. We've got the best hardware, the best equipment, the best strategies. We can pulverize nations end to end and reduce them to rubble. Not a problem. Not a problem. The problem that arises with the modern Western militaries is there comes a point where you have to put boots on the ground in the foreign country. And as soon as the real world fighting starts, we immediately start to get bogged down. Now, we are able to occupy nations. We have spent some time managing to occupy Afghanistan until that got too hard, and we spent some time managing to occupy the Middle East, but that's not going to last too long. It's we're losing our strength. Our intellectual classes have been basically pushing the West on all these fool's errands, all this overseas adventurism, all this social change at home that has brought us incredible amounts of harm and detriment to our people and our culture. So the intellectual classes now have basically run Western society ragged. We're not going to be capable of even looking after our own people in our own nations in the very, very near future. This is already happening, and to a large degree it's been thanks to the Western intellectual classes. So what's happening now, and this is a very interesting play out of events, is first of all we had the intellectual classes decades ago decided we needed to have more foreign immigration into the West. We needed more brown people, more Muslims. The Jewish sector, they love this stuff. The Jewish power bloc in the West, yeah, we love our immigrant buddies. Open borders for every Western nation, but not for Israel. So this was seen as a wonderful, highly intelligent thing to do. Open your borders, fill your lands with all these brown people. Think of all those poor refugees in the Middle East, and you white people should feel so very, very guilty that you've started a war over there. Now open your borders and let all the refugees in. Okay, so that first of all, we had that phase. But now the West once again is winding up for a huge shit fight with Islam. We're about to take on Iran. We're really rattling the cage there. And so what we have here in the West is a very, very large Islamic population now. That these wonderful geniuses, these liberal intelligentsias, all told us it would be a wonderful thing for world peace and the diversity of our own communities in our Western nations if we invite all these Muslims in. And what they've actually done is they've invited into our own nations the primitive brute force factor. And now they're having an overseas war and absolutely poking the primitive brute force factor overseas. And the problem is we now have tens of millions of these people living in our Western lands. Now, there is one thing I will give a tip of my hat to Islam, is that it's very, very resistant to the seductive machinations of the liberal machine here in the West. In general, Muslims have remained very loyal and true to their culture, and we can mock them, we can laugh at them, we can talk about how much better we are morally. As Western people, we're so much morally better than those primitive Muslims. Oh, ha, ha. Well, we're the idiots that flooded our nations with Muslims, these so-called primitive backwards people. And now we're provoking a major international war once again with the Muslims. So this is a classic example of the kind of utterly self-defeating and destructive policies that have been enacted and pushed through by the liberal intelligentsia in the West. It's an absolute recipe for disaster. Anyone with half a brain cell can see this. In fact, I'm just some bogan guy. I literally never got past year 10 in school. I grew up on the street, so I grew up with the school of hard knocks. What I do have in my brain is common sense and street smarts. So common sense and street smarts will beat your cosmopolitan liberal high IQ factor any day of the week. I could see what was coming 10 years ago. I've been talking about this stuff for 10 years. You liberal high IQ people, you are so smart that you can't actually recognize basic reality anymore. And now you've destroyed your own nations, your own homelands, and you deserve everything you have coming. Everything that you have coming. It's going to be one hell of a shit fight. I can tell you that. I can guarantee it. Okay? And you guys started it. You guys deserve to bear the brunt of it. All right, my friends. Thank you for listening to my little rant. I love you all, and thanks for the support from those of you who donate financially. There's some links below. I will catch you all. God bless. Over and out.